The tomb was empty, but what did they see? After the events of Good Friday, the grief and the despair was overwhelming. All that Mary had left was that final chance early on that Sunday morning to visit the tomb in which Jesus lay. It was the custom to visit the tomb of a loved one for 3 days after they had died. It was believed that the spirit of the dead person hovered around the tomb for 3 days, after which it departed as the body was so decayed. And no one had been to visit the tomb on the Saturday, as it was the Sabbath, and so would have broken Jewish laws. Desperate to pay her final respects, Mary visited at the end of the 4th watch of the night, between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. It would still have been dark, with only a hint of dawn breaking. Mary arrived at the tomb expecting to find it as it would have been left on the Friday after Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus had anointed Jesus' lifeless body with myrrh and aloes and wrapped him in grave clothes from head to toe, as was the custom. The tomb had been sealed with a heavy circular stone. But what she found when she got there shocked and distressed her even more. She couldn't believe her eyes. The stone was rolled away and the tomb empty. What had happened? Had the Jewish authorities removed his body to prevent Jesus reaching people even after his death? Or was it simply grave robbers? Mary loved Jesus. Her heart was broken. She didn't know what to believe. She didn't understand what had happened, so she went to tell the disciples to find out what to do next. Peter and John, in their turn, didn't know what to believe either, so came rushing to the tomb to see for themselves. So here we see amazement and disbelief. When we first hear of the story of the resurrection, it seems impossible to believe. It's some fantastic made-up story, a fabrication. There is disbelief. Like Mary, like Peter and John, we may be bewildered. However, despite not understanding what had happened, Mary didn't give up loving Jesus. So do we, despite our lack of understanding, continue to love and believe what happened to Jesus? Do we have to understand first and then believe? Or can we, out of love for Jesus, believe and then in time come to understand? We see the 2 disciples, John first and Peter second, arriving at the tomb. Mary had told them this garbled story about the stone being moved and the tomb being empty. They needed to check out the facts for themselves. They needed to see what she was talking about. John gets there first, but holds back. He looks in from the outside. He considers the evidence and reflects on what he has seen. Peter arrives and immediately goes into the tomb, but he still doesn't fully understand. It's only when John has noted the grave clothes were laid out in such a way as if Jesus' body had simply evaporated, rather than having been dragged out of the tomb. This wasn't grave robbers, or even Jewish authorities arranging for the removal of the body. It was then, seeing those grave clothes in the shape that they were, that John saw and believed. He then remembered that Jesus had spoken about this. He would die, and then 3 days later would rise from the dead. It wasn't from reading books or intellectual study, but from seeing the evidence that John came to believe. Of course, it's important to study the Bible for what it tells us, but very often it is by seeing or experiencing how another Christian lives and how their faith pervades all that they do, that we can come to an understanding of what the risen and living Christ can do for us. When you learn a new skill, you might read up all the instructions on how to carry out that skill. You may learn all the theory behind it. But it's only when you try it out and practice that you become confident in that skill. We assume that Mary came back to the tomb with Peter and John and remained there after they had returned to the other disciples. She was distraught with grief, blinded by her tears and staring into the empty tomb. Mary sees 2 angels in the tomb who ask her why she's crying. She tells them of her distress and confusion about where Jesus' body is. She then turns away from the tomb and sees a man who she thinks must be the gardener standing behind her. And then she turns back to the empty tomb. And it's only when the man, Jesus, speaks her name that she turns away once more from the tomb and looks directly at and recognises Jesus. Do we spend so long gazing at the empty tomb that we fail to see the real person of Jesus standing right beside us? Mary encountered Jesus standing beside her. She saw him, she heard him, and from what Jesus says to her next, she probably reached out and tried to touch or embrace him. She didn't recognise him immediately because she wasn't expecting him to see him there alive. But when he spoke her name, it was a personal and amazing invitation. When we encounter Jesus personally for ourselves, then we can really, truly believe. When we acknowledge that Jesus came to earth, lived among a ragtag group of people and died for us, for you and for me, then we can truly believe he is alive and living amongst and within us. The essence of Christianity is not knowing about Jesus, but about knowing Jesus. It's not about reading lots of books about Jesus, what Jesus did. Rather, it's about seeing, hearing and feeling how Jesus affects everything we say and do. It's not about discussing or debating theological arguments about Jesus. Rather, it's about meeting him through the lives of others in church, but also in the workplace, the village, in the supermarket, the hospital, so many different places. It may be a specific moment in time, or an awareness of a more gradual process. Remember, Mary did not meet Christ until she had seen the empty tomb, until that moment when she couldn't believe what had happened. However, when she did meet with Christ, her response was joy at seeing the living Christ and an overwhelming desire to want to share it with others. If you are staring at the empty tomb, Jesus may be close at hand. Turn away from despair and see the risen and living Lord. Let us respond with joy and that desire to share the joy with others. The tomb was empty, but this was no empty promise. What do you see? Jesus, the risen and living Lord? Amen.